These are the sounds of Poppies, a restaurant, bar, nightclub and live music venue that was based in Melville, a suburb in the west of Johannesburg where I live. Until a few years ago, Poppies was located on 7th Street, the vibey bohemian high street known for its funky bars and restaurants, as well as for the persistent criminality that plagues the area. While this is usually restricted to phone theft and pickpocketing, crime in Melville has sometimes taken a much darker turn. As New Year's Eve turned into New Year's Day and 2019 turned into 2020, Poppies was the site of a horrific drive-by shooting. Just after midnight, a black BMW SUV drove down 7th, slowed past Poppies and opened fire on the group of revelers on the pavement. Two people were killed and 6 others were seriously injured, one of whom died later. Despite Melville's extensive security infrastructure and investment in surveillance, the crimes are still unsolved more than 3 years later. While episodes of violence are not unusual in this violent country, the Melville drive-by shines a light onto the tangled relationships between race, infrastructure, crime and surveillance in contemporary South Africa. In this episode, we'll follow the process of events, speak to experts and key witnesses, and consider some of the main theories that continue to swirl around these unsolved murders. You are listening to Material Crimes. My name is Nicky Falkof. I'm a writer and academic born and raised in Joburg, but left when I was 18, first to Cape Town, then to London and eventually Brighton. I moved back here in 2013 for a job at the University of the Witwatersrand. I never intended to end up back here. When I left in 1996, I was relieved to be away from my hometown, which I found dull and uninspiring. It was only years later that I realized what I'd been missing. Despite a lot of ill-advised adolescent hitchhiking to goth clubs in the inner city, my suburban upbringing had kept me from seeing what Joburg really is. A wildly creative and constantly mutating African metropolis. A city of migrants. A city famous for its hustle, its glitz and its irreverence, barely 100 years old and constantly remaking and cannibalizing itself. I love and resent Joburg in equal measures. It's the city I think about and write about, but also the city that has me in a permanent state of low-level anxiety, worrying about power cuts, water outages, dangerous streets, road safety, crime. Of course, always crime.
Everybody comes to hang out here and yeah, it's pretty cool.
By now you know that Melville is one of the coolest neighborhoods in Johannesburg, and on that note, today we'll bring you multiple reasons on why you should consider visiting this weekend. The suburb boasts as one of the oldest areas in Joburg, presenting itself as an ideal place for people to live, work and play.
Much of my personal anxiety is bound up with Melville, the charming but periodically unstable suburb where I live. Like the rest of the city, like all South Africa's cities, in fact, Melville still bears the visible scars of apartheid, the brutal racist white minority regime that was legally in place from 1948 to 1994. I say legally in place because while the formal system may have been voted out, many of its features remain. Not least in how white South Africans in general are spared the worst of the poverty, violence and powerlessness that characterizes our society. Apartheid relied on a legalized system of segregation to keep different racial groups from mixing and to reserve the best lifestyles and access to employment for whites. Like the majority of middle-class areas, Melville was zoned as whites only during apartheid. Black, Indian and coloured people were legally banned from living here unless they were employed by whites, which usually meant being an exploited and poorly paid domestic worker who was shoved into a shoddy building out the back of a nice house. I'll come back to these racial classifications a bit later. For now, let's just say that they have specific meanings in South Africa. Melville is an interesting and variable neighbourhood. It's long been associated with working-class white Afrikaners, particularly given its central role in the long-running soap opera Sewendelaan. You could think of this as an Afrikaans version of gritty British and Australian soaps like EastEnders or Neighbours. Melville's comparatively affordable stock of semi-detached Victorian cottages and proximity to Joburg's two major universities and various media houses has attracted a bohemian mix of artists, academics and journalists who've been populating this area since the late apartheid years. It was the obvious choice for me to move to when I came back to South Africa. It felt welcoming, interesting and noticeably more diverse than other parts of suburban Joburg. I joined an established class of homeowners and renters, many with long-standing connections to the suburb. Distressingly to some locals, however, demographics change. Melville is now also home to a transient body of largely black university students, some living in bad conditions in overstuffed and poorly planned commune housing, others enjoying their parents' cash in 7th Street's seemingly endless profusion of dodgy bars. The suburb also plays host to a population of homeless car guards, beggars and other informal workers. It's a site of constant tussles between middle-class, often white, homeowners on the one hand, and on the other, business owners, partygoers, renters and visitors. Like so many South African suburbanites in the post-apartheid era, these different kinds of people tend to find themselves arguing over their different ideas about what their area is and should be like. But of course, there's more to a neighbourhood's character than what locals want it to be. I started writing this episode when I was housebound with a small baby. So when I needed a clip of a Saturday night at Poppy's, I engaged my assistant, aka boyfriend, and ordered him to go out and get a pint. As well as an idea about what to record, he was sent off with my usual list of caveats. Keep your phone in your pocket until you get inside the bar. Make sure no one follows you out if you walk home. Send me a message if you'll be out late. My series of cautions is not just a consequence of the anxiety of new parenting. Joburg is, of course, best known for crime. And as I suggested at the start of this episode, Melville is viewed as a hotbed of opportunism. It's one of those suburbs where you go out drinking and come home without your phone, where fights break out outside bars, where cars are broken into late at night, where community WhatsApp groups share stories of home invasions and discuss which armed response security company is the most reliable. The Residents Association is currently floating a controversial plan, well, controversial to me at least, to close off the entire neighbourhood so some roads are permanently shut and access to the main thoroughfares is controlled by Beagle Watch, a private security company. Here's Beagle Watch's marketing department offering some handy tips to South Africans.
One way of preventing would-be assailants from being opportunistic and acting on impulse is by being more aware of your surroundings when visiting public spaces. Never leave a shop or public space with your purse or phone in hand. Do not talk on your phone or message whilst walking to your car. It advertises the fact that you have valuable items and it distracts you from your environment. When you reach your vehicle, do not rummage through your bag to find your keys. This creates a soft target. Put away your phone and purse while still in the store. Get your key in hand and make sure there are no distractions when you leave the shop. Scan your surroundings for suspect scenarios or people that might be following you. Walk with purpose and be assertive. If you encounter a situation where you feel uncomfortable, go back to the store and talk to the security officer or call your security provider. There is a difference between living in fear and being aware. Make it a habit and share it with your friends. Be safe.
When suburban residents in South Africa talk about crime, they don't usually mean the corruption that's gutted the state in the past 15 years. or the white-collar crime perpetuated by rich elites that nets billions of rands. What they mean is theft, assault, robbery and violence committed largely by black men. Plans like increasing security technologies, hiring private security companies and shutting off roads, which are marketed as crime prevention measures, are also designed to restrict access to wealthier suburbs. This mindset insists that only certain kinds of people should be allowed in, those who belong in these areas, and those who service their lifestyles. This kind of restriction is of course almost always related to race and class. Black men, in particular poorer and informally employed black men, are casually demonized. Whether they're involved in crime or not, black men are constantly targeted by technological and social surveillance systems. Almost 30 years after apartheid formally ended, the spatial segregation of South African cities persists in new forms, now supported by one of the largest and richest private security industries in the world. Of course, I'm not suggesting that crime isn't a huge and frightening problem in Joburg. Rather, I think it's impossible to talk about crime in Joburg without considering the ongoing consequences of apartheid spatial planning, legalized racial inequality, and a violent liberation struggle that was never really resolved. And of course, we also need to consider the economics. Some people, some industries, are making a lot of money out of other people's fear. When we talk about risk, danger and security in Joburg, we're also talking about what happens when a city is built for the elite, when racial injustice is literally part of its urban planning. Crime in Melville, then, is an ever-present undertone that colours daily life, one that we are in many ways used to. Its constant presence is just another feature of our anxious city. But not all episodes of crime are the same. Let's get back to where we started, the shocking events of New Year's Eve 2019, which rocked the suburb of Melville and led to an explosion of theories, conspiracy and otherwise, about what really happened. Investigating these theories may help us unravel some of the tangled mythology of race, crime and fear in Joburg.
Good evening, yes, in Zinga, quite a somber mood here in Melville. Very different from what you'd expect on a normal holiday afternoon. It usually will be a bustling with many patrons filling up the bars and restaurants on 7th Street. Today, a summer full, but it's not that bustling energy that you'd expect, here on a normal time. Poppy's is one of the very popular restaurants, usually full to capacity, especially on weekends and on a Friday afternoon, especially now during the holiday season. Today it's now closed, this after that tragic shooting that took place outside. What we see is flowers being laid for those victims, friends of the two victims who passed on, which were two women aged between 30 and 40. They both lost their lives.
The people who were injured and who died after the Poppies drive-in were ordinary Joburgers enjoying a New Year's celebration at their local. There's never been any suggestion that any of them were personally targeted. And Melville was not the only place in Joburg to experience unusual gun violence that night. Shots were fired from a seemingly identical vehicle using the same kind of weapon at two other locations. The Jolly Roger Bar in Parkhurst, a fancier suburb to the north, and Mary Fitzgerald Square in the inner city area of Newtown, where the crowd was peppered with gunfire from up on a nearby highway and at least 12 people were injured. In both cases, it's incredibly lucky that no one was seriously hurt. Newtown in particular could have been a massacre. As far as we know, the only drive-by deaths that night happened in Melville. I'm in my office on the Wits University campus preparing to meet Antonette Gouws, a senior administrator who runs the Wits History Workshop. Antonette was at Poppy's the night of the shooting with her two daughters and some friends. I feel a bit anxious that I might be overstepping a boundary in asking her to speak to me about this, and I don't want to feel like I'm exploiting her so I can tell this story. But I also trust that she wouldn't have agreed if she didn't feel okay about it. She has a near-perfect recall of the events of the night and of the layout of the bar.
I ran out, and when I got outside, I just saw people lying. So I ran out of this door And I just saw people lying there right in front on the pavement everywhere. And I looked. I'm like, Chris and Tia, where are you? So they all went in. They went under the table.
Okay.
You know, so, but I mean, there wouldn't have been any protection in. Apparently, the car went past the first time, and then it came the second time. You know, the first time it went down this way in this direction, and then when it came up, you know, came back in the opposite direction. When he did the shooting, the same car came back. He was, Nicky, I'm telling you, so he started shooting. So this is, say, our table is here, this is our table, and then there's like a railing, just a very short railing, and then immediately after that it's the two tables on Poppy's side of the pavement. So the guy literally just the bullet, it shows that they literally started shooting like 2 or 3 seconds after passing our table.
Holy.
So the people who got shot were the people who were sitting on the tables here, who were standing in front of the door and whatever.
Oh my God.
We were just 6 meters away. So, and I mean, the kids were, you know, the kids, they were there at the table. And then, of course, our bags were there. You know, we left our bags with them. So there were these guys, opportunists, you know, who went immediately when people started scattering, leaving, going under tables, they grabbed people's bags.
Oh my God,
so
that's the most
bags,
Joburg thing I have ever heard.
Yeah. I had my passport and my thingy, my ID in there. So, yeah. I lost, and of course, my cell phone, so I lost all of that, my glasses. And
it's like insult to injury, though. Like, it's not bad enough you've just watched a woman die in front of your face.
I know, it was terrible. And that's the one thing that haunts me is that, you know, I feel so bad, but was jumping. I literally had to jump over her body, and it was so slippery because there was glass, water everywhere, you know. Yeah. And I actually slipped, and I fell on a chair that was already lying on the floor, like lying upside down. I actually fell on the chair because in my rush, all of this probably happened in 2 seconds where I see her lying there, I see blood. I'm like thinking, my God, my kids are there. And then I look up and I see all the people lying outside on the pavement, and I'm like, but my children are like literally just 2 meters away from, I see this because you can't see the table from, I was like, no. And I'm like, and I just said, I'm sorry, I am so sorry. And I just jumped and I ran and I screamed. So yeah, and she's the one thing that haunts me, like it for 3-4 months, maybe even 6 months after the shooting, is like every time I close my eyes, the one thing I saw was it's just this woman lying there with the blood in, like, you know, like she's trying. This is the closest I came to death. I've never seen a dead person or somebody, never ever, you know, unless of course you go to a funeral and you view a body, but this,
that's something sanitized different. For you. It's like.
So so that was very traumatizing, you know, seeing that. But of course I was so happy when I saw, oh no, you know, the kids are all fine, nothing happened.
During the interview, I realized that Antonette is actually relieved to speak about what happened. Both the trauma of witnessing these murders and the momentary terror of knowing that her daughters were so close to danger. One thing that my talk with her made clear is how intense this experience was, how violating it can be to get caught up in the kind of spectacular violence that's so common in South Africa today. Antonette's story really brings home the personal costs of the historical and infrastructural injustices that have led us to where we are now. Despite Joburg's reputation for criminality, drive-by shootings are almost unheard of here. This is a form of violence that is strongly associated with gang activity. In much the same way that South Africans make ourselves feel better by remembering that at least we don't have a US-style problem with school shootings, Joburgers make ourselves feel better by insisting that at least we don't have a problem with gang violence, which absolutely plagues Cape Town, outside its tourist hubs and well-maintained city centre. Although, as we'll see later, this is in fact not the case. It's just that gang violence in Joburg is generally contained in specific areas, and those of us who live elsewhere rarely hear of it. In the minds of most residents, this kind of killing, this kind of randomness isn't supposed to happen here. In Joburg, if you get hurt or attacked by a stranger, it's because they want your stuff and are willing to damage you to get it. It's called comfort, of course, but is one of the ways in which we process risk in this dangerous place. For this, as well as all the usual reasons, the Melville drive-by was particularly distressing. Over 3 years later, the police have no real leads, and the suburb continues to buzz with theories that pull in a range of powerful ideas and anxieties about race, class, safety and belonging. I'm sitting in Café de la Crème, a faux European coffee bar at the bottom end of 7th, just down the road from Poppy's original location, waiting for Daniel Nunes. Danny is a proper local character, sometimes known as the mayor of Melville. He used to run a liquor store over the road from my old house, so we chat. More recently, he's become closely involved with the MSI, the Melville Security Initiative, a community project that's trying to push crime out of the suburb. Danny is the kind of guy who always has the inside story, and he's happy to share some information about the night of the drive-by.
In terms of not the severity of damage, but the majority of damage was actually at the Mary Fitzgerald incident. So it's believed they sped off from Melville, they hit a left onto Empire and straight onto the highway, and when they reached the top of Mary Fitzgerald Square, they let rip with a few more shots off the top of the bridge.
And they were using handguns, presumably.
Yeah, so it's believed there was one handgun that they used for the whole thing. I think 12 or 17 people were injured at Mary Fitzgerald.
Wow.
It's just very, very lucky and very, very fortunate that none of those wounds were that hit somebody in a part of the body that could have been fatal. It was all like minor wounds, and I think Mary Fitzgerald is a square, and they just jammed the people into that square for New Year's Eve. And I think when the first gunshot went off, people just ran, and it made it hard for them to hit a target.
Right, okay, because there's nothing hemming in that square. You can
100%. Whereas if you look at Parkhurst and Melville, they stopped outside a place.
There's buildings everywhere. There's nowhere to go.
You know, people thought, hey, fireworks. They didn't even realize guys were outside shooting. Very traumatic.
Very, very traumatic.
Very, very damaging for an area.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Melville is still perceived to be a dangerous place because of that.
Yeah. Much to residents' distress, it seems likely that the geography of the suburb had a lot to do with what happened that night. Melville is relatively unusual in Joburg in having, or at least having had before COVID, an extremely vibrant nighttime economy on an easily accessible road. Many of the city's social hubs are in malls, parking lots and other privatized spaces, while other neighborhoods with busy high streets, such as Norwood, Parkhurst and Maboneng, are comparatively difficult to exit at speed. In Melville, however, it's a matter of a few blocks to get from 7th, where the bars and restaurants are, to Main Road, which quickly becomes Beyers Naudé, a busy 4-lane arterial that provides a quick escape from the suburb's tangled streets. One of the recent initiatives aiming to deal with Melville's crime problem was the introduction of security cameras on a network owned by a company called Vumacam, related to Vumatel, which sets up fiber optic cables for internet access in wealthy areas of South Africa. Vumacam has made an absolute killing, if you'll excuse the poor taste pun, selling surveillance systems to residents' associations across the country. This is paid for by levies on residents who are encouraged to sign up for the association's preferred private security provider. These businesses then have access to Vumacam's live camera feeds. The cameras are mounted on poles, which Vumacam allegedly set up without consultations with the city of Joburg, or COJ, in a kind of corporate land grab. There's been much talk about smart technology and 4IR in South Africa, but someone associated with the COJ recently complained to me that many of the security cameras are pointed at intersections rather than at places where crime happens. It seems that the most lucrative part of Joburg's new surveillance system is selling footage of car accidents to insurance companies. Many people have written about Joburg's notorious obsession with security. For my money, one of the most insightful is Martin J. Murray, a professor of urban planning at the University of Michigan. I worked with him on a chapter about Vumacam for his most recent book, The Infrastructures of Security, Technologies of Risk Management in Johannesburg. The book shows how deeply people's ideas about class, status and belonging are tied up with their fears about crime and their desperation to feel secure using whatever means they can. This is a section read from the introduction by my friend Nkululeko Sibia, who's doing his PhD in media studies here at Wits University.
In highly inequitable and racially divided cities like Johannesburg, at the hard edge of hypermodernity, one dominant feature of everyday life is the inescapable tendency to blend the urban design of the built environment, the architecture of enclosure, and the policing of public space into an all-encompassing, single-minded security effort to protect the aspiring well-to-do from the permanently poor. The spectre of dangerous criminals lurking everywhere has gone hand in glove with a pervasive nervousness that accompanies everyday life. Private companies have not only taken advantage of opportunities to sell comprehensive security systems, but they have also helped to create markets for new designer security products that cater to personal preference and lifestyle choices.
The Vumacam security cameras had been installed on 7th before the night of the drive-by, and at that stage was still being touted as the answer to Melville's problems. In the wake of the murders, though, it became clear that the killer's car had used cloned license plates. So while the camera feeds could offer at least some sense of the chaos and the carnage, they were more or less useless when it came to identifying the perpetrators. Melville's middle-class security infrastructure, its technology, its private offices, its bars and high walls and electric fences and panic buttons and beams and backup batteries, was not designed for this kind of crime. Here's Danny Nunes on the effects that the drive-by and an earlier shooting in 2003 have had on the suburb.
Like I said, the history of 7th Street has been plagued by those two shootings.
Right,
yes,
okay.
We've had other type of crimes and other deaths, but you can actually almost pinpoint it and say it was an altercation that escalated in the other incidents.
And this is something completely different.
This is something completely different. The energy, the feel.
While the deaths of the two women on site are heartbreaking, one of the parts of this story that bothers me the most is the third death, which happened later. One of the people struck by a bullet was a car guard. Car guards are informal workers, almost always black and male and very often homeless, who work on the street directing cars in and out of parking spots and keeping them safe from break-ins in exchange for small change or even restaurant leftovers. While they often work the same areas for years on end and assist with everything from carrying, shopping to washing vehicles, car guards tend to attract the ire of the more privileged. In Melville, they're often spoken about as a nuisance and sometimes as a source of crime themselves. The man who was shot that night was rushed to Helen Joseph, a nearby public hospital, and later died of his injuries. He does not feature in much of the media coverage, and I couldn't find anyone who could confirm his name. As horrific as the other deaths are, as shattering as they were for families, there's something particularly awful about the unremarked and apparently unremarkable murder of a man who was not part of the fun, who was ignored by South African society in death as in life. Here is Jubi Raja, the owner of Poppies, often known as Poppy, talking to ENCA News. This is one of the few times where the murdered car guard is mentioned.
There was another sad incident. The car guard was the first one to get the bullet. A month ago, they operated on him again, and his mom got in touch with us to say that he passed away. So it wasn't 2 deaths, 3 deaths now. That was the sad, sad part about it. My heart gets very sore when I think about it because it was young lives.
The car guard's death really brings into focus the often malign interaction between race crime and infrastructure in Johannesburg. This was a man who scraped a living by providing a flimsy performance of security to middle-class car owners, many of whom would probably have assumed that he was a criminal of some sort simply because he was black, poor, and doing informal labour. This was also a man who understood the neighbourhood well enough to survive on its fringes against significant odds, who had a specific and complex relationship with 7th Street, but whose death made almost no dent in the narrative of the drive-by and what it meant for Melville. Popular understandings of these events were shaped by a different set of racial and social structures. Pretty much as soon as it happened, the shooting became the subject of rumours and theories. South African attitudes to masculinity are an important part of understanding the first theory about the drive-by. that it was the result of a pavement argument between two men or groups of men, some of whom later returned with a gun and peppered the crowd with bullets out of rage at a perceived slight. This is journalist Mike Apple on ENCA News reporting this rumour a few hours after the shooting.
As we understand it at the moment, just after midnight, there's an altercation that takes place. One of those involved in this fight that took place outside of Poppy's restaurant in Melville says he's coming back. This is according to eyewitnesses who saw the fight taking place. Shortly after that, there's a vehicle that drives past and several shots are fired seemingly indiscriminately into Poppy's restaurant. At least 2 people were shot dead and up to 6-7 people injured, some critically.
Antonette heard a version of this story on the night, but it didn't really make sense to her as an explanation.
The story was, it was this fight, so everybody was talking about these gangs.
Okay, so that's what everyone thought it was, the guys who left
It was the guys who left early, who had a fight, and then they obviously came back, and then there was... But then the guys who were standing at the door who was shot wasn't the guys who had the fight, who were standing there, because you would thought that if they were the same guys, then they would come around. Since the car went down first, he was just driving down slowly, and then he came up again, that they were obviously looking for who it is that they want to shoot. So they came back, and then they shot, and they said, but those were not the guys.
It's just completely random.
Yeah, it was just, So I don't know. Oh, God.
In the days after the killings, this story did the rounds on social media, in WhatsApp groups and in local conversations. It's true that South Africa is an unusually violent country, that we suffer from a damaging mix of poverty, patriarchy, racial inequality and bastardized claims to cultural authenticity, and that this toxic combination impacts on how we raise boys and how they behave when they become men. It's also true, however, that we are awash with casual, unquestioning associations of black and coloured masculinity with violence, going back to the pre-colonial era, and that these damaging stereotypes also impact on how boys grow up. It's extremely telling that in the wake of the murders, so many people were so quick to believe the rumour that the drive-by was a consequence of a drunken argument, that a South African man would be so outraged at having his pride insulted that he would go home, get a gun and return hours later for a murder spree. This story made the drive-by easy to understand. It was just another consequence of the innate violence of black men. Despite its swift travels, this theory was quickly disproven when the man from the pavement altercation was found by police, interrogated and provided a sound alibi. Fears about the automatic violence of black men proved to be a distraction from the real racial issue that crowded responses to the drive-by. In the words of a friend of mine, Poppy's is a coloured jol. That is, a coloured party. Despite the reliable shock displayed by black Europeans and African Americans on Twitter, in South Africa, coloured is not a dirty word, and it is not exchangeable for black. Coloured was one of apartheid's main racial designations. In its loosest definition, it refers to mixed race, but this really doesn't do justice to its internal coherence. Coloured identity is not just biracial, it refers to a heritage, a culture, a language, to food, clothing, religious belief, architecture, politics. Coloured people are recognisable to each other and to others because of social features like accent, humour and aesthetics, as much as by their names, locations and physical traits, which of course are never homogeneous anyway. This is a teaser for a web series called Coloured Mentality, available on YouTube, where a group of activists, artists and everyday people from Cape Town's coloured community collectively unpack their understanding of colouredness. Most definitions of colouredness consider this broad community to be descended from both indigenous San and Khoi tribes and from Malay and other slaves, many of them imported from Dutch colonies in places like Batavia, which more or less corresponds to present-day Jakarta. Some associate colouredness with Islam. Some think of it as a South African Creole. There are long-standing and bitter arguments about prejudice and status between coloured and other racialized communities. Coloured identity really is complex and plays a particular role in the racial consciousness of South Africa. This is Vally, a filmmaker and academic based at the University of Cape Town.
part of it, you have to think about what colored people represent. This idea of colored came about really like as a way to provide a buffer between white people and black people in apartheid society, and also as a catch-all term for anyone who didn't fall neatly within these boundaries of black and white. Both of those ideas of black and white are arbitrary and shift over time and in different contexts. I'm classified as colored in South Africa, but for example, when I was in Nigeria last year, people asked me like, by the way, are you white? Are you a white person? And I've never gotten that anywhere else in the world. And I was like super shocked by that. I was like, what is it? Like, have I not been in the sun this year enough or whatever? Like, am I looking very pale or sickly? I think colored people fit in between two different things. So like the idea of colored people is like we are somewhere in between. And it's always had that connotation in South Africa. And I think there's a danger. I'm trying to think who said this. I think it might have been Stuart Hall in one of his essays. He was talking about there's a danger of not fitting neatly into a box or either space, of being able to represent someone neatly. It's partially about that. I think the danger of not knowing what someone is or how they fit in.
The association of poppies with colouredness is important because of another theory that quickly popped up, and that was actually propagated by the police, which claimed that the shootings were connected to an alleged ISIS cell operating undercover in Joburg. This is the theory that's apparently had the most traction with Poppy herself and with some other members of the coloured community. I did try to interview Poppy for this podcast, but despite initially agreeing, she was reluctant to make an actual plan, which of course I had to respect, so I'm relying here on what other people have said. It seems that at least some believe that Poppy's was targeted because colouredness is often associated with Islam. So a popular bar that caters to the coloured community became a magnet for religious fundamentalism. Danny Nunes is not convinced by this theory.
The reason I feel it's a gang is that nobody really put their hand up and said, it was us, we did it, like a terrorist cell would do. Yes, that what happened that night we can definitely define as an act of terrorism, and I'm sure if the right people were arrested, they would be charged with terrorism. But to me, it just feels like it's not exactly terrorism. If we look at something like what happens in the UK and in France, where a shooter goes crazy, or a school in America, it's not that level of terrorism. In South Africa, when people hate people, they normally target a very specific person.
Yeah.
On that night, and I know Poppy might actually get upset if I say this, but it doesn't look like it was racially motivated, because when they went to Parkhurst, the people who were targeted and injured were white. If you look at Melville, they targeted Poppies where it was mostly coloured people.
Yeah.
I believe the two ladies were coloured people. I know definitely one of the guys who was shot, because I know him quite well. He was a coloured gentleman. I think the other DJ was a coloured gentleman. And then if you look at Mary Fitzgerald Square, it was African people of African background that were targeted. So it's very hard to say it's racially motivated when they actually targeted 3 different racial groups.
The coloured connection is also important because, as I mentioned earlier, drive-by shootings in South Africa are considered to be a particularly gang-related form of crime. And in South Africa, the idea of gangs is often imagined in relation to colouredness. The Cape Flats, the deprived area to the north of Cape Town where black and coloured South Africans were dumped during apartheid's forced removals, has long been plagued with gang violence. Here's Dylan Vally again.
On the Cape Flats and in Cape Town more generally, there is a problem of gangsterism, also in other parts of the country, but the representations of coloured people have often been associated with crime and gangsterism. And I think a lot of that has to do with media representations, because I think in Johannesburg, colouredness means something different. Initially, I think there's a different kind of nuance in the way that people see colouredness in Joburg. So coloured people in Joburg are, I found it really great, for lack of a better word, that coloured people were so integrated with black people in Joburg, and that there was like a very thin line between, and very porous line between colouredness and blackness. Whereas in Cape Town, that line is very clear, and it's reinforced through, as it is in Joburg as well, but I think a bit harder in Cape Town, like, through geographical social engineering that apartheid did, that still lingers today. And I think it's really interesting, this idea of the colored gangster really infiltrating a Joburg mindset, because I always felt in Joburg I could just be myself.
What Dylan is pointing to here are the visible and often very dramatic polarities in how race is experienced in South Africa. It's easy to get stuck in thinking that race is this monolithic thing, that the ongoing problems of race in this country are entirely because of our history and because black means X and white means Y. But it's really not that simple. Context, geography, spatiality, and infrastructure, as well as local histories, really do influence how race works. For example, people in Joburg and people in Cape Town have different boogeymen, different kinds of people whose presence in a neighborhood seems to suggest crime and danger. One of the things that makes the drive-by so significant is that it inaugurated a new figure of threat, one that's not native, again, if you'll excuse the poor taste pun, to Johannesburg. Dylan's personal experience of poppies and of Melville, as well as his own history of growing up coloured in this country, have left him unconvinced by some of the myths that swirled around the drive-by.
I think with the case of poppies, people were trying to make sense of something that was quite a shocking news story, also because it happened on New Year's Eve, and I think most people felt like it could have been me too. I could have been walking on the street. And I know poppies well because my uncle was actually a frequent poppies regular. After he died, we had his memorial kind of reception at poppies. I know the crowd well. I know the people there well. And it's just like people, like middle-aged people having a good time. I never sensed that there was any gangster activity, anything like that there. I don't know if there was underneath somewhere, but it seemed like a very chilled place to hang out, and kind of like a place I could take my parents, that they would be comfortable hanging out. So yeah, it was surprising to hear that it became this thing of maybe there was some gang activity going on there. It must have been a hit or that kind of thing. But yeah.
Danny Nunes, on the other hand, definitely subscribes to the gang theory. Perhaps unconsciously, he too draws a close link between gangsterism and coloured identity. Here, he's talking about Melville's proximity to Westbury, a working-class coloured area with a terrible reputation for violence, which was originally established as Western Coloured Township.
So, I would personally get the feeling that what happened that night was some sort of gang initiation. If you look at all the areas where there was a shooting, we're relatively close to Westbury. I hate to sound like a stereotype type of person, but it is a gang-filled neighborhood. Gangs do run out of Westbury. There is a lot of gang shootings in Westbury. There is a lot of... It's not as bad as the Cape Flats, but it's like a mini Cape Flats.
Even for Danny, assuming this was a gang killing leaves many unanswered questions. Antonette, on the other hand, is less concerned with the search for answers. For her, the drive-by remains something personal and painful that's changed the way she feels about her life in Joburg.
But Nicky, I'm glad that I actually spoke about this. Like I said, this is actually now talking about, because I've never spoken to anybody other than my friends who were there about it. And this actually kind of help. It's
but it's a lot of trauma to hold. I've never seen a person get killed like that. That's heavy.
No, it's I even see her now as I'm talking to you. It's such a clear vision in my head. I don't think it will ever go away, And this, I had this guilt. I was you could have stopped and you could have done something.
Yeah.
But I'm my kids. What if my kids were lying there also in a pool of blood? Exactly. It's my children,
And that's normal, right? That's survivor's guilt. Everyone gets that. You always feel like you could have done something.
You could have done. I know, but yeah. That was it. So now it's you go out these days, but you're very cautious. It's Sunday afternoon and I'm walking down 7th Street, Melville's central drag, accompanied by my long-suffering boyfriend who's keeping an eye out for phone grabbers. We've already been warned twice by friendly car guards to put the phone away just in case.
The security cameras on their high poles lurk at the top of the road like dried-out monuments to an earlier version of the neighbourhood. There are more boarded-up shop fronts than active businesses. The Zimbabwean wire art makers smile and say hi, but they look exhausted. And you have to wonder who they're selling to now that most of the tourists have gone. A couple of the bars look busy, rammed with young, attractive people necking discount cocktails, and the second-hand bookshop is open and overflowing as always. Post-drive-by, post-COVID, mid-power and water crisis, Melville feels very different, but some of its bones are still there. The drive-by has been back in the news recently. Police claim they found the murder weapon more than 3 years later, buried in a farm in Kliprivier. Perhaps the bereaved might finally get some answers. For the rest of us, however, knowing who and even why may not make much difference. The conflicting stories that swirled around the murders, the shattering experience of being so close to lethal violence, the increased anxiety and securitization of our spaces and our streets, the fear and anger about who does and doesn't belong here. These things are set now. Like the potholes, the guard huts, the jacarandas, the generators and the armed response signs, the consequences of the Melville drive-by have melted into the background of this complicated city.
Wow, Nicky, what an episode. Starts off with a drive-by shooting and then ends up being this kind of complex, complicated, space-based, locational commentary on race. Like, I think that it's such an incredible, sad, challenging, but also like really real representation of how life, social constructions of crime, of race, of class all become intertwined. And like listeners of the show will know I'm a big fan of your work already, Nicky, and it did surprise me the direction that the episode went in, but then knowing you and knowing your scholarship and knowing how good you are at kind of critical reflections of race, place, time, it didn't surprise me in the end. So yeah, thank you so much for producing such a thought-provoking episode.
Thank you. That is very kind. You were born to podcast.
Yeah.
It's an amazing, amazing episode. And just the subtlety with which the story unfolds and kind of through this meandering, very human tale that's rooted so deeply in the kind of specifics of Melville, you also tell this much broader story, which is just, it was a marvel to listen to, but also amazing to work with you and see you tell this story.
This has been my favourite thing that I've done in a really, really long time. And putting this episode together made me realise how incredibly frustrated I am with academia. Well, being able to do what we're fundamentally doing, or at least what a lot of us are fundamentally doing, is we're trying to tell stories. And we find ourselves hamstrung or kind of facing these crazy obstacles at every turn because we can't tell our stories without citing Homi Bhabha, right? We can't tell our stories without bringing in theoretical notions that are completely impenetrable for normal people. And it's actually really annoying. It kind of drives me mad. So doing this just made me realize how, as much as I enjoy scholarly writing, I also think that a lot of the time we kind of stop ourselves from doing what we're really driven to doing by needing to produce writing that's sufficiently scholarly to be acceptable in the academy. It's annoying. It's frustrating.
So I wanted to pick out something then specifically about the way you tell this story. But the journey you're taking through Melville, like literally walking through Melville, talking to some of its key interlocutors and characters, like the mayor of Melville, as you call him, but also the way you kind of care for people's stories that I thought was so special. Like, especially there's a part where you are talking to someone who was in the bar that night, and I just feel with you that for you personally that you're engaged with trying to hold this person, trying to let them talk, but also realizing for them it was really important to share that with you. And I'd love, maybe you could talk a bit more about that experience of talking and holding stories as as an ethics of care, actually, for the work that I guess everybody's trying to do with this type of podcasting.
I guess, again, it's an instance for me of why this is such a valuable form and why it really does people shifting from kind of traditional scholarship to work like podcasting is not taking some sort of sideways step. As a media scholar, I mostly look at texts. I don't do a lot of interviews. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not an ethnographer. I don't talk to people in person that often. So talking about such a deeply upsetting and traumatic event to someone who had actually been there, who I know personally, because we work at the same institution, felt like but difficult because it's not something that I'm particularly comfortable with doing, but it also felt like an opportunity to allow her voice to have more volume than my voice. There's only so much I can say in my kind of, putting it all togetherness analysis of what I think happened that night and what I think that means. There's only so much I can say that's really significant. At the end of the day, what's really significant is what happened to the people who were there, the people who died, the people who were hugely traumatized, the people whose lives were affected in all sorts of different ways. And I think perhaps when you're doing kind of media or sociological work on crime, which seems to be what I do a lot of the time, it's very easy for individual voices to get lost. And it's very easy for the nuance and the detail, the texture of personal experience to get lost. And this was an opportunity to really foreground that. So that was something that, felt ethically challenging because I wasn't entirely sure how to do it in a way that put her across completely authentically, but also felt like, it was something that was worth trying to do well, I guess.
I just think that, and I'm going to bring in some sociological speak now, and listeners might be able to tell that I'm in the middle of writing at the moment, but I think that your podcast really showed the tensions between structure and agency in everyday life. And as Sherry said, it was really clear, the emotion, the embodiment that you brought to the interviews, that's so important. We're not just actors, we relate to structures, we relate to race, class and place. That is something real and it's something felt. And so often in the academy, we try and say that we need to see ourselves as objective of these things, but it's just not the reality at all. And if we're not talking to those tensions between structure and agency, those tensions between how society is made and how it makes us feel and how we experience it, then what's the point in our work?
Yeah, that's basically the big question, right? What is the point of it if we're not capable of understanding that, theory is theory and theory can only take us so far because we're talking about individual human experience? I mean, I think South Africa is a really great, particularly Johannesburg, is a really great laboratory for talking about this tension between structure and agency, because obviously everyone here has been impacted in some way or another by the really messy, chaotic, violent and traumatizing structures that have been imposed on ideas of race for a really long time, and we still continue to be. But also, people respond to that in radically different ways. So, this is a city where on the one hand, this is on my mind actually, because I'm dealing with quite a traumatic situation at the moment where a student of ours was involved in a hit and run car accident the other day, and we're just trying to get her to hospital and get her looked after. So on the one hand, this is a place where people become so bitter and dehumanized and lacking in empathy that they are capable of enormous acts of violence, like running someone over or stealing their handbag when they're vulnerable on the floor because they have been run over, or breaking into a home or harming another human. But on the other hand, this is a place where a complete stranger will pick you up off the ground and make sure that you are okay. These are people who deal with the same sort of structural crises and the same sort of ongoing structural exploitations and abuses in radically, radically different ways. There is this constant tension between kind of violent aggression and almost, unusual levels of warmth and humanity that you encounter in Johannesburg that I think, it really puts it in stark relief how the way in which we react to the structural constraints that are imposed upon us. This is not just to do with where we come from. It's also to do with something that's a lot harder to quantify, something deeply intimate, deeply personal, deeply individual. And we need to not lose sight of that when we are approaching social issues as scholars, that we can't quantify everything.
I mean, I think your episode really captures also some of the kind of, the sort of racist fetishisms. And maybe that also applies to Johannesburg in general as a city, around the kind of ideas of crime, criminality, and the way that does really kind of dehumanizing work. You can't imagine the possibilities of people kind of caring for one another, like people picking someone up off the street, because, you see it. I mean, I say you because it's kind of cast exclusively in terms of this like kind of avarice, violence, aggression, crime. But actually on that, I thought it was interesting that you said that Joburg is kind of a laboratory, because one of the things that I think, your episode touches on is the kind of ways that it's a laboratory for these security technologies. So like you talk about Beagle Watch, you talk about Vumacam. And I really wanted, when I was listening to you, I really wanted to ask, or listening to the episode again, I really wanted to ask you about the kind of international connections of those security technologies. Like, where have they gone? How can we see what's happening in Melville, in Johannesburg, as connected to the kind of broader transformation of urban environments that we see all over the world, especially now with the kind of introduction of like smart cities?
I mean, I don't have a coherent answer for that because I haven't done the research. But I do know, because I've vaguely approached the research, that these connections do exist. I know, for example, that some of the major South African security companies are outreaching into places like Australia, where they're making a lot of money. And I know that companies like ADT, which has a huge presence in South Africa, is a global corporation, and that they use South Africa as a way to test out not necessarily the functionality, but rather the marketing of new security technologies. Because if there's another thing we learned from the urban laboratory of Johannesburg, it's that no security technologies actually work. Right? As soon as something new comes up, someone finds a way to bypass it. And obviously living here, this makes things quite scary, because you feel like you can't really afford to, there's no way you can buy your way into safety, no matter what you're told you can afford. But there's also a way in which what this does is it helps us think about security technologies as something that's to do with the market rather than to do with actual physical or human safety, right?
Yeah.
I think that what's significant about Joburg as a laboratory for urban life in this sense is that it makes it abundantly clear how effectively security technologies and how effectively security companies are weaponizing the global explosion of cultures of fear in order to sell us more and more and more stuff. Whether that stuff is an armed guard on your street, or that stuff is the particular type of technology that you need to have in your SUV to keep your kids safe. I was astonished when I spent a few months in Mexico City to see how much security apparatus was all around the city that was so similar to what I see in Melville, the high walls and the bars and the razor wire. And this is in a city where people happily walk around at night. I'm like, if people are walking around at 10 o'clock at night on their phones, what are we so afraid of? Why do we have ADT badges and armed guards on every corner in this particular neighborhood? So I think what we see from the astonishing, somewhat disturbing explosion of security companies and security privatization in South Africa is this marketized sense that, yes, you can buy your way into safety and security in an unsafe and insecure world, but also the kind of underlying collective knowledge that you actually can't, that you're actually always, to some extent and in some way, vulnerable. And I really think that that's something that's affecting people in cities around the world, particularly the middle classes, but not only the middle classes. It's just that the middle classes, as always, are louder about it. But this overwhelming sense of vulnerability that is creeping into big cities. You know, you're seeing it in London. You're seeing much more security technology in London than you used to when I lived there. No one had burglar alarms when I lived in London, which was back in 2005. And now you see signs for armed response companies in wealthier areas, which is such a shock to me.
I mean, one of the things that I have to say I was really fascinated to hear was actually the point that you make about how these security companies are actually not even really doing anything to kind of make money off security. They're just selling the data that they're collecting to insurance companies. So they themselves are essentially admitting, we can't make you safe. We don't even really care. We are just using this as an opportunity to kind of hijack your data, as much data as we can, and sell that on in a way that's actually very common to kind of tech companies in general. You know, they're like harvesting all of our data and kind of, selling it on. But I just thought that was a kind of really fascinating admission on the part of these companies. Obviously not an active admission.
No, I mean, you're right. It's really significant, I think, the fact that I've been told by people that I spoke to for this project that, the main usage of Vumacam cameras is to know who's at fault in an insurance, when there's a crash and there's an insurance claim, that they actually know they can't do anything. And this is so tied to smart technology, because when the cameras were being brought into Melville, everyone was going on about they're smart, they can tell they're smart. And then they realized quite quickly that what a smart camera can do is it can pick up something unusual, but not something usual. So it can pick up a person where a person is not usually seen, but it can't pick up a person doing something nefarious on a street full of people. It just doesn't have the capacity to evaluate human behavior in this really, really complex way. So what you end up having is this kind of unfiltered, completely pointless data that can tell you something is there, but cannot tell you what that something is. But nonetheless, you're getting sold this idea of smartness, of machine intelligence, as the only kind of realistic and viable way to protect yourself in the face of an overwhelming flood of human threat. And I think it really is significant that this has taken hold of the public imagination in such a strong way in South Africa. We have had so much government talk about 4IR. The university that I'm at, other universities are constantly going on about 4IR. We have smart cards for the collection of the grants, of the SASSA grants, the very small monthly grants that the government gives to people. And this is a country where children still drown in pit toilets. This is a country where we have developed this term, load shedding, which basically explains the rolling blackouts that we now have for up to 12 hours a day in some parts of the country. Why are we so obsessed with smart technology when we can barely get unsmart technology to work? And I think it really suggests the way in which security companies have been involved in the kind of extreme weaponization of the idea that the increase in technology will somehow make things better. It's a status game. It's an arms race.
It's capitalism, isn't it? It's just money.
It's just straight down the line, unvarnished capitalism. Like, if you have this thing, you will be safer, aka better, aka more middle class. It's just become another, like, having more security tech has just become another way to show how fortunate you are and how well resourced you are.
Yeah. But then it doesn't actually map onto this quote unquote safety.
I wouldn't say so, no, because you hear stories constantly. There are news reports constantly about crime happening in the suburbs and crime happening in the gated communities. No one is safe, but no one is safe anywhere. And, the question of no one being safe makes us wonder what safety is. What does safety mean? Mm-hmm. Is it possible in that way to be safe? And of course it isn't. No one lives a life free of risk. Mm-hmm. But the security industries are trying to tell us that even in this incredibly disturbing high-risk environment, if we spend enough money, somehow, magically, we will free ourselves from risk, at least until we go outside. And then outside is terrifying.
I mean,
so, they're very, very efficient. They're very efficient at using people's fear, both fear of crime, fear of being hurt, but also fear of falling behind, fear of a lower status. They're very good at using all of these different kinds of tools to make you think like you need to buy more things.
So there are two things that I wanted to kind of think about that with, which is on one hand what Chantal was saying about like the straight out capitalism, or like maybe the promise and broken promises of modernity and progress, and the way that that gets mapped onto our sense of ongoing vulnerability, because, and you say this really beautifully in the episode, because of the way it also maps onto histories of like racial configurations of what we see as threatening and what we see as vulnerable and what we see as safe and what we see as not safe. And like, for me, I really wanted to ask you to kind of come back to that, like how this entire universe of selling security taps so deeply into people's ongoing and existing memories of apartheid, but also a realization that apartheid doesn't leave just because they changed the law.
Oh, that's such a gorgeous question. I mean, also awful. So one thing that you're making me think of is the fact that when you leave the suburbs of Joburg and you go into poorer areas, you go into townships, where obviously crime is more prevalent, right? And there is more danger. There is actually a much higher risk than there is in the previously white suburbs that you may be harmed or your property may be stolen. You go into townships and you see people have high gates on their houses and razor wire on their houses and all sorts of security apparatus. But you also see that people leave their gates open all the time, and that people move in and out of each other's houses. And also that it's very clear that anyone who knew what they were doing would be able to bypass this kind of security apparatus, which makes me think about some of the academic work that's been done on consumption, post-apartheid consumption, particularly by Black South Africans, who were kind of banned from the world of consuming by apartheid, right? They weren't allowed to buy nice things, not only because they didn't, it was very hard to get money to buy nice things, but also because it was very hard to get into a mall where the nice things were sold, because you were told very clearly that you didn't belong there, and geographically that was probably quite far from where you lived. There were all these ways that Black people were locked out of the pleasures of consumption, which of course was a way for apartheid to attempt to lock them out of the pleasures of modernity. And then I wonder, we look at how a city like Joburg works now, and how security is just another one of the many things that we are expected to consume and display as part of our class performance. And I wonder how much, people who are less well off, how much their kind of display of security apparatus is also about status. Right? It's also about a kind of a class performance. It's also about, in the suburbs, there are high walls and razor wire everywhere you look. So in my area, there will also be high walls and razor wire everywhere you look. And it's very saddening, because firstly, it kind of suggests, that link between race and consumption hasn't really been broken, that there's still a sense that you can buy your way into a higher class position, which in the context of South Africa pretty much always means a higher racial position, not necessarily becoming white, but being adjacent to whiteness in this country still does give you some sort of social standing. I mean, I know a lot of Black people who I'm friends with would reject that idea entirely and angrily. But what I'm talking here is, I'm not talking about whiteness as in white people. I'm talking about whiteness as in, the idea of white tone. That there are certain types of schools, certain types of ways of speaking, certain places that you live, certain ways that you dress, all of these things that are kind of adjacent to whiteness that connote upper to middle class activity, right? So that is very sad. But secondly, I think the kind of collective generalized emphasis on security in this country is partly, of course, to do with our very high crime rate. But the way in which people in poorer areas have jumped on this with so much alacrity and enthusiasm, I think also has something to do with the fact that most people in this country never felt safe. They never felt safe during apartheid. They never, of course, felt safe during the colonial era. They were not safe. They were permanently at risk from the police, from the state, from violent legislation, from just the generalized shitty behavior of everyday white people. And that possibly in the post-apartheid era, there's been some kind of attempt made by people to claim safety. And this is now what we are told constitutes safety. Safety is not a more functional state, because that's not really what we're fighting for. Safety is not, neighborhoods that work together in all sorts of different ways. Safety is not building communities. Safety is having a higher wall and more razor wire. And so everyone in every strata of society is aiming to try and impose that sort of safety on their homes if they are at all capable.
what an incredible episode. What an amazing chat. Like, I'll never tire of hearing your analysis of these things, Nicky. Like, I feel very blessed to be able to be in conversation with you during these times. It's really urgent conversations and lots to think about.
I feel very, very blessed to be able to be part of this really quite, I think, important and valuable platform that actually lets people talk about all of these very difficult things in ways that are a bit more human and humane. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.